Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to welcome you to the Czech National Bank's quarterly meeting with analysts. Even though it's a regular event, today it's a special one because it's the last opportunity for Czech National Bank Governor Jiří Rusnok to meet with you. So let me welcome and introduce all speakers for today. Governor Jiří Rusnok, Executive Director of the Monetary Department, Petr Král.
Hello to everyone.
Deputy Executive Director of the Monetary Department, Luboš Komárek.
Good morning.
And the Director of the Macroeconomic Forecasting Division, Karel Musel.
Good morning.
The first item on our agenda is a new quarterly forecast, which will be presented today by Luboš Komárek. Luboš, you have the floor.
Okay, dear Mr. Governor, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present our spring monetary report today, and it's obvious that its preparation was greatly influenced by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The outline of my presentation is the following. As you can see, I will start with the assumptions of the forecast. Then I move to the core part of this presentation. It means to our new macroeconomic forecast. The third part of my presentation compares our new forecast with the previous one. It's quite short, only 3 slides, which was prepared during the winter. It means, again, as I said before, a Russian invasion to Ukraine. The final part presents our monetary policy scenario. It means scenario featuring a more distant monetary policy horizon, which really played a significant role at yesterday's meeting of the board. Now, the first slide from this presentation shows you assumption of our forecast, which is related to the external environment outlook. As we can see, the economic recovery was significantly interrupted by a Russian attack on Ukraine on 24th February. This is the main current source of uncertainty. Also, the supply chain disruptions, which are currently the most severe ever, will thus probably drag on until 2023. As you can see from the top left panel, GDP in the effective euro area will grow by 2% overall this year and will accelerate further in next year. The current extraordinary growth in foreign PPI, as is visible from the top right panel, is driven mainly by energy prices. It means natural gas, oil, and other raw materials. And as is also visible from bottom right panel, the price of oil has risen continuously since the beginning of 2020. From, let's say, roughly $35 to $105 per barrel. Last panel demonstrates that the ECB monetary policy is shifting towards expected sharper interest rate hike. We will see when. Okay. The This slide shows you also deeply development in producer prices in effective euro area and commodity prices. As you can see, foreign PPI, as you can see from this top chart, foreign PPI had already strengthened sharply in the second half of 2021 and intensified in early 2022 as a result of this attack on Ukraine by Russia. There is a clear increase in the importance of the energy component, especially due to surge in natural gas and electricity prices. And this you can see clearly from bottom chart. Brent oil, if this is visible, is in blue color, and electricity is in green. However, growing prices of other industrial commodities and persisting stress in global supply and value chains, which is visible in core producer price inflation, also passing through to inflation. Okay, now I would like to move to fiscal policy. This is the second assumption of our forecast, which concern of the development of domestic fiscal policy. And this is an exogenous assumption of our forecast, the second one. And as is evident from the top chart, nominal government consumption growth will slow from 6 to 6% in the last year to 2.8% in this year. And the first reason is that the large part of the previously high pandemic-related spending, especially in healthcare, will be ended this year. The second reason, let's say in this way, relates to wage freeze for employees in government sector. But rising health and education expenditure linked with the arrival of Ukrainian refugees will have the opposite effect. And I will discuss this issue a little bit later. The chart below provides evidence that the fiscal impulse will slightly dampen GDP growth this year because of termination of many of the support programs. And as I put here, this will be partly offset by the other measures on both the revenues and expenditure slides of public budgets. Okay, and as I already mentioned, the second part of my presentation is the main part, consisting of the baseline scenario of our new macroeconomic forecast. And I will start with the development of the most important variable for the Czech National Bank, which means with headline and monetary relevant inflation. Headline inflation is high. In March, it reached 12.7%, which you, of course, know. And it will accelerate significantly further in the second quarter and be in double figures for the rest of the year. As you can see from both charts, CPI inflation will fall close to the inflation target and the end of the monetary policy horizon, owing to the easing of the current exceptional price pressures and to the previous tightening of domestic monetary conditions, which we started during last year. Monetary policy relevant inflation, if you can see, it's this light blue line, will be below headline inflation over the entire forecast horizon due to changes in excise duties, which is possible to see from the from the bottom slide. As is evident from this top chart, which refers to the components and core inflation, the most important component of escalating price growth are core inflation, followed by administrated prices, food prices, and fuel prices. Within core inflation, prices of both tradables and non-tradables are rising sharply. The yearly massive contribution of imputed rent will increase further in the second quarter of this year, but start to decrease gradually in the second half of the year. The growth in imputed rent, this is this blue columns in the bottom chart, reflects continuing sharp growth in property prices and high growth in prices in construction sector. And this is due in large part to the global supply chain difficulties which are giving rise to shortages of building materials. Okay, next slide is about administrated food and fuel prices. And this slide really brings a deeper look at the evolution of those parts. It means administrated food and fuel prices. As you can see from the first chart, administrated prices will increase further. They will reflect high exchange prices of energy, whose growth to levels unseen until recently is also being fostered by Russian invasion of Ukraine. Housing-related energy, it means electricity, natural gas heating will continue to get more expensive as seen in one of the previous slides, it means before. In the next year, the administrated price growth will slow but remain elevated due to the gradual pass-through of the previous growth prices on energy exchanges. The growth of fuel prices, which you can see from bottom chart in red line, will remain high through this year, but will start to fall due mainly to a drop in global oil prices. And also grow in food prices, which is also possible to see from bottom chart here. This is this blue line, will intensify in the near future, being driven mainly by growth in world agriculture commodity prices. Next slide is about cost pressures, and really this chart demonstrates from the modeling point of view inflation pressures from costs in the consumer sector and in the intermediate goods sector. As you can see from the top chart, the strong growth in overall cost pressures at the turn of the year was driven mainly by energy import prices. And I would like to point out here that the increased contribution of core import prices was driven by accelerating growth in core foreign producer prices. And I already showed this. The growth in cost will gradually slow this year due mainly to two factors. First, slower growth in energy prices, hopefully. And second, to lower growth in prices of domestic intermediate goods. Then I will move to domestic cost pressures, which will ease this year as the contribution of wages will decrease further. And we assume that most wages will be only partly indexed to the high inflation. You can see this from the bottom chart. The contribution of wages to grow in domestic costs will start to strengthen gradually this summer as a result of efforts to make up at least partly for the high inflation. These effects will intensify even further next year. And now I am moving from inflation and development of prices to labor market. Now let me briefly describe the situation on the labor market, which is and will continue to be tight. You can see this from the top chart. We have here employment development and unemployment development of unemployment rate. In the case of employment, this will continue to rise on the back of strong demand for labor among Czech firms and higher labor supply due to workers arriving from Ukraine. The unemployment rate, the red, which is in red, will rise slightly in the coming quarters, but remain very low and the lowest in Europe, even European Union. We make the assumption that inflation will not be significantly reflected in wage growth in the first half of this year. There are two reasons for this. First, firms are facing high costs during the energy crisis and also problems in global value chains. This will weaken the bargaining position of employees in numerous sectors. For this, see the bottom chart. Second reason is that there is the arrival of large number of refugees, which will tend to lead to lower wage growth. And let's say in summary, it can be said that moderate nominal wage growth, together with high CPI inflation, will result into a deep decline of real volume of wages and salaries this year. Okay, and next slide, or this slide, is the slide which I already announced, and this is about Ukraine nationals on the Czech labor market. Really, this slide shows the participation of Ukrainian nationals who have entered or will enter the Czech labor market. From the top chart, you can see clearly that Ukrainians in the Czech Republic earns less on average than workers from other countries and Czechs, as they work in lower paid occupations. It means there is no any discrimination, but simply because of work in lower paid occupations. However, their wages is given occupations are very similar to those of Czech workers on the similar positions. The arrival of large numbers of Ukrainians in the Czech Republic, as you can see from bottom chart, will put a downward pressure on future wage growth due to these two effects, namely due to composite effect, as Ukrainians will probably at least initially take position at the lower end of the wage spectrum, and let's say secondly also due to higher competition on the labor market, since higher labor supply in the Czech Republic will decrease the currently high labor market tightness. Next slide is about GDP growth forecast. The GDP forecast of our spring report is visible really from this first or top chart. This is this fun chart of the GDP. Economic growth in the Czech Republic will dampen again this year, as you can see. The primary reason is persisting problems in global value chains computed by the war in Ukraine. The secondary reason is the worsening sentiment of Czech firms and households. GDP growth will slow significantly to be 1% this year in whole terms. In the next year, it will pick up to around 3.5%. The contributions to GDP growth are shown in the bottom chart. Higher economic growth in 2023 will be driven by net export, followed by investment and household consumption. Negative contribution will be given by change in inventories, as it's visible from this bottom chart and for the year 2023. This slide is about household consumption. This slide really provides more in-depth information on the development of household consumption, which is closely monitored by the central bank in the assessment of demand pressures in the economy. And as you can see from the top chart, growth in household consumption will halt this year and resume next year. The contributions to household consumption are shown in the bottom chart. Consumer appetite will be suppressed by a further increase in inflation, which will accelerate the fall in household purchasing power. And really, an important role will be played by fast-growing housing-related expenditure, especially on energy, which will meanwhile drain another large part of the forced savings created by households during the pandemic. I would like to add that the differences across household income groups in the amount of forced savings can be very, very large. Consumer sentiment will not be favorable this year either. In addition, household spending will be dampened by growth in market interest rates. As inflation falls and wage growth pick up next year, the income situation of households will improve and their real consumption will start to rise again. Next slide is about investment, and really this slide provides again more in-depth information on gross capital formation. From the top chart you can see the contributions of private investment, this is in blue, government investment in red, and inventories in yellow. Private fixed investment will decline overall this year. It will continue to grow next year as the difficulties in global production chains fade away and external demand picks up. Second, let's say, note is about government investment, which will continue to increase in this year with financial support from EU funds and new generation EU programs. Next year it will rise further, supported by absorption of EU funds and planned purchase of army helicopters. Addition to inventories will remain close to last year's extreme levels until mid-2022, and the fall of gradually, and then fall gradually, excuse me. Exports and imports. Okay, exports will be dampened this year by continued supply disruption and by the war in Ukraine. It will start to grow again as these issues fade out, see bottom chart. The fall in imports will exceed that in export due to a significance of the domestic demand. This is visible from bottom chart too. And now I am moving to FX market. One of the most important variables for the small open and export, of course, oriented economy is the development of the exchange rate. According to the forecast, the koruna will strengthen close to 24 korunas per euro in this quarter due to a further widening of the interest rate differential vis-à-vis the euro area. From this fun chart, it's clear that the koruna will fluctuate in a wider range just above this level, or 24 korunas per euro next year. Stronger appreciation will be prevented by two main reasons. First, still feverish sentiment on global financial markets related to the war in Ukraine, and second, continuing difficulties in international trade. These reasons, coupled with high commodity prices, will be reflected in seizable goods and services deficit from the perspective of balance of payments. According to our prediction, tightening of the ECB monetary policy at the end of this year and gradual decline in domestic interest rates will also prevent the koruna from appreciating in the next year. Now I would like to discuss interest rate path of our prediction. This fun chart shows the interest rate path for 3 months PRIBOR, consistent with the baseline scenario of the forecast, and I must emphasize in which the central bank sets interest rate in order to achieve 2% target at the standard monetary policy horizon. It means 4 to 6 quarters ahead, is a further sharp rise in market interest rates until the middle of this year, followed by a gradual decline. The forecast surge in rates is a response to two main factors. It means first, a combination of exceptionally strong price pressures from abroad, and second, persisting domestic inflation pressures are reflected in accelerating and broad-based price growth. The subsequent decline in interest rates in the forecast reflects an expected decrease in inflation pressures next year, conditional on the initial monetary policy response. Third, quite short part of my presentation traditionally briefly compares our new forecast with the previous one. It means with the pre-war forecast prepared during this winter. And here the first slide compares the foreign assumptions of the previous winter and current spring forecast. The thick line represents the new forecast, the thin line, the previous forecast, and the dashed line shows development of shadow rates. As you can see from the top left panel, foreign economic growth outlook has been revised down for both years. This year mainly because of longer-lasting supply chain problems, along with the impacts of the war in Ukraine. The market increase in the foreign producer price outlook, which you can see from the top right panel, reflects a jump in prices of most commodities coupled with supply chain problems newly aggravated by the war. The bottom right panel shows the markedly higher Brent crude oil outlook is subject to exceptional uncertainty and is associated predominantly with the impact of potential sanctions on Russian oil export. The last panel compares the development of 3 months Euribor, and as is clear from this chart, the expected 3 months Euribor has shifted higher due to ECB's expected reaction to the higher inflation outlook. Second slide from this part compares domestic economy. From the top right panel, it's clear that the GDP growth outlook for this year is substantially lower due mainly to a greater than expected cooling of domestic demand. The significant upward revision of the CPI inflation forecast in this year, please you can see this from top left panel, is due to all its components. It means faster growth in inflation abroad, which has moved the outlook for domestic core inflation upwards considerably. Second, the further rise in the administrative price outlook is due to higher energy price growth. And third, the food price forecast, which is significantly higher due to higher growth in agriculture commodity prices. And from the bottom left panel can be seen that due wage growth is lower mainly for this year due to weaker economic activity amid high production costs mainly. The employment of refugees also playing or will play a role. Finally, the corona will be weaker than in the previous forecast over the entire outlook. And this you can see from last panel, bottom right. And last slide from this part compares forecast and is related to 3 months PRIBOR. The third slide finally compares this. And it means 3 months PRIBOR of the previous winter and current spring forecast, to be clear. The interest rate path has shifted significantly higher. It's very clearly visible from top chart. The initial state fosters higher rates in this year, mainly reflecting faster growth in foreign production prices at the start of the year. The higher rates are also due to the short-term inflation forecast and the outlook for faster growth in administrative prices, as you can see from bottom chart. The foreign outlook fosters higher rates over the entire forecast horizon, reflecting less accommodative ECB monetary policy and stronger contribution of the core foreign PPI, which really play important role in our prediction process. The contribution of the energy component of import prices reflects higher outlook for exchange prices of oil, gas, and electricity. And frankly speaking, expert adjustments foster lower rates over the entire forecast horizon, and this is here the red columns. The final part of my presentation describes the monetary policy scenario. As I already said in the beginning of my presentation, and this is scenario featuring a more distant monetary policy horizon, which really played an important role at yesterday's board meeting. In this scenario, monetary policy horizon in the Taylor rule is shifted by 2 quarters in the future. It means from 4 to 6 quarters in this Taylor rule equation. Thus, the central bank abstracts from inflation development, which is being directly affected by exogenous price shocks that will influence inflation at the horizon of 12 to 18 months. This scenario also assumes that inflation expectations remain anchored to the target. The market interest rate path is lower than in the baseline scenario, especially this year, peaking at almost 6%. And this you can see from top right panel. The exchange rate of the koruna is significantly weaker due to substantially narrower interest rate differential. And this is visible from bottom left panel. The lower interest rates coupled with the weaker exchange rate lead to distinctly higher inflation than in the baseline scenario. This you can see from top left panel. And the inflation target is overshot by more than 2 percentage points at the standard monetary policy horizon. The effects on GDP are visible from last panel. And this was the last slide of my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention, and of course, I have to say Slava Ukraini. And I now give the floor back to spokesperson of the Czech National Bank, Markéta Fischerová.
Thank you, Luboš, for the very insightful presentation. Now let's move to the Q&As. I would just like to ask you to unmute your microphone and introduce yourself before taking the floor. Well, do we have the first question, please? Helena Horská.
So again, Helena Horská from Raiffeisen. First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to thank Mr. Rusnok for grateful, transparent, and coherent leadership of Central Bank during the very tough years, including COVID crisis and also the Ukraine crisis. And I hope that we will see very soon, and we will continue with a very, I would say, base fact discussion. So thank you, Mr. Rusnok. So my question, and now would be more tough questions. So let's go. The first is, the thing is that you are starting again accelerating the rate hikes from the last one by 0.5 to the yesterday one, 0.75. My question is, it doesn't mean that now you are going to accelerate the rate hikes to reach the expected level that it's including in your base forecast, not the alternative, but the base forecast. So I'm asking on some kind of forward guidance for the future step in your policy. Of course, this is my personal question. The yesterday decision was affected or was not affected by the knowledge that you as a governor, you will finish the term, and you decided to use the opportunity to raise the rates faster because you are afraid that after the end of your position in board, the central bank and board will not be able to decide it for more aggressive rate hikes. And of course, I have another questions, but I also leave the floor for other colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Thank you for your words of respect. So, to your first question, I think it's not a time, from my perspective, and I hope for the most of the board, to use kind of forward guiding in respect of the interest rates. As it was many times repeated, the time is extremely uncertain and risky. We do not know what will happen in the even near future, not speaking the more prolonged future. So I will not do it that also here, including the interest rates. Of course, as you get the presentation and you have know the new forecast. The situation is really tough with regard of the pressures in inflation domestically, but mainly, of course, exogenous supply side pressures. And the basic remark and the basic line, I would say, from this perspective, from the board perspective, is we can't avoid to react to this developing situation. Most of the board is, I would say, naturally persuaded that we have to react to increasing pressures on the inflation side, regardless that it is, of course, mostly at this moment coming from the external and supply side sources. Because anyway, there are some secondary and another row effects going into the domestic economy, and because the domestic economy situation generally is still, I would say, inflation friendly in some respect. I mean, the extremely low unemployment rate, which is persisting. I mean, still a relatively hot market of the real estate, and of course, continuous, let's say, kind of challenge with the balance of the public finance. And if you add to this the very uncertain situation on the FX market for our region, if you add to this definitely significant worsening of the balance of payments for this year for the Czech economy, it's I think the base for this kind of thinking about the necessary reaction of the central bank. So that's the let's say background of our thinking and decision. Nevertheless, I wouldn't insist that this will be the same in 6 weeks in the future, because as we see, the situation is really changing very dynamic, and we will really very much wait for a new figures, and we will dependent very much on coming new informations. It means definitely we can't exclude that we will hike further also on the next monetary meeting, but I wouldn't speculate at the moment how much it could be or it should be. Regarding your second question, you know, in my perspective, we've been absolutely free of that finishing and changing terms for respective people in the board. I didn't feel at all these in their comments and expressions, because I think everybody is aware what is our terms. We do not see. Of course, my situation is easy. It's absolutely easy for some of my colleagues. It could be more difficult, I can imagine, but I think that they were very much and very well aware that there is no direct link between what we will decide, how they will vote, and what will happen in the Prague Castle. So no link in my perspective. There was a third question? No. Thank you.
Thank you. What about next question? Yeah, Jakub Seidler.
Yeah. Hello, also thank you very much for invitation and for great presentation. I have 3 questions. First for the staff, please, what's the assumption of the growth of electricity and gas prices for 2023? I see that contribution should be around 2 percentage points, but given the future contracts for 2003 and 4, which are elevated, whether there is no some risk for further increase in electricity prices. Second question, maybe for Mr. Governor. He was mentioning yesterday during the press conference that using FX as a tool for monetary policy is now not planned, but your recent comments were a little bit, or seems to be more inclined to start with this tool. So whether the discussion in the CNB is now that you really do not want to use the FX tool, because some comments earlier suggested that you are maybe a little bit willing to try it at least. And the last question would be whether the fact that you agreed more intense selling of the FX reserve income means that it will a little bit lower need for future hikes, because it will provide some support for the corona. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I'll start regarding the first one, and my colleague will add some details. As you can see in the upper chart in the slide of 9, there is a strong contribution of electricity, natural gas and heating to the dynamic of regulated price growth stemming in the next couple of quarters. This has been reflected the very strong spikes of these prices in commodity exchanges, which were exacerbated by the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. We know that in the Czech specific case, the transmission of the world energy commodity prices to domestic prices is somewhat staggered, as the domestic electricity and gas providers use typically quarterly dates for adjusting their prices, and that they have already bought some electricity and gas on the forward market before the autumn energy crisis hit the world and before the war broke out. That's why the transmission is relatively, let's say, distributed over time, but the peak should come in late 2022, and after that the regulated price growth will decelerate quite significantly, despite being somewhat above the levels we had seen many years before, when the prices were stable in the commodity exchange in the world. And the contribution regarding the individual component is easily to be seen from the graph. And maybe Karel will add something to that.
From my side, I will just add that there is an assumption that there will be some partial correction from the currently high energy prices. But indeed, what is important for us, it's more about the pass-through of these relatively high prices into the costs of the producers, into the regulated prices that will be gradual throughout the rest of the year.
Okay. To your question regarding the use of the interventions on the FX market, specifically yesterday there was not a big discussion about that topic. We basically quite easily agreed that we will only continue what is already running some months. So the sale of part of the yields of the FX reserves, and we have decided to increase the amount in certain way, and generally more to this. We have had some specific discussions with the staff, with the experts in the board, and generally the result of that was consensual that we will rather try to avoid to focus on FX as a kind of monetary policy instrument. We of course not exclude the use of FX as a kind of last resort emergency tool if necessary, which is completely not the current situation, but not a kind of regular, let's say, boosting tool to our effort to maintain the inflation at let's say normal way. Yeah. So I don't know if it is understandable, but basically that's what happened. Do you like to add? Yeah, maybe this. Yes, it was.
We simply do not know what the future development of the exchange rate will be, especially under these current very strange circumstances. We will definitely take into account all relevant and all necessary information when producing first the assessment of the existing forecast on the next monetary policy meeting, which will be held in June and which will actually be the last one for Mr. Governor. And then we will be preparing our summer forecast using our standard procedures and tools. So we will see. It would be very premature just after having completed the current forecast to speculate about the new one.
Thank you. Who's next? Jaromír Šindel.
Jaromír Šindel, Citibank. Good morning to everyone. I would like to ask about the fiscal policy. You have widened the fiscal deficit outlook for this year, for the next year. But if I look at the composition of the forecast of the change of the 3 months PRIBOR, there is no large impact of this change of the fiscal policy on the path of the 3 months PRIBOR. So if you can a little bit elaborate what's your expectations for the state budget and what is behind this, let's say, larger deficit without any impact. Second question would be about the experimental judgment which we see in this chart about this 3 months PRIBOR change, which assumes some easing of demand-driven inflation pressures, usually faster than usually, whether this assumption is also included in this alternative scenario that you have published. And the last question would be probably for Mr. Governor. Czech National Bank published, let's say, the assessment of the fulfillment of the inflation target, and the monetary policy was found also responsible for this, let's say, misalignment of inflation development. So what is your lessons, let's say, from the monetary policy perspective, and maybe some recommendation for the future bank board? Thank you.
I'll start with the fiscal policy assumptions of the new forecast. Basically, the fiscal impulse hasn't been changed much compared to the previous forecast, as we have obtained new data from spring notifications of the public deficit and debt, and we have some new estimates of the previously of the previously approved fiscal discretionary measures that were in place during last year and during the current year. The bulk of the previously approved COVID-related measures will subside, as they were approved to be very temporary, and this will generate in a mechanical way a negative fiscal impulse of approximately 0.5 percentage point for this year. And on the top of that, the government has been putting in place new suggestions and new measures on both expenditure and revenue side, especially concerning the influx of refugees from Ukraine, and especially relating to the help of Czech people to withstand the very strong negative impact of rising energy prices on their disposable income and on their purchasing power. These measures have been somewhat diminishing the negative fiscal impulse for this year, but the change is very low, or the magnitude of this is so far very low. And as you can see, we ended up with the final negative fiscal impulse of minus 0.4 percentage points. The revenue side of the public budgets is, and besides having taken into account the fiscal discretionary measures, is endogenously driven by the worsened economic outlook for this year, which has been driven especially by the very subdued private consumption and private investment, and this will generate somewhat slower revenue or tax revenues during this year compared to the previous forecast. But this is not fiscal discretionary kind of thing that would be incorporated in this fiscal impulse. So the change is still so far relatively mild compared to the previous forecast. As for the expert judgment in the decomposition of the interest rate forecast vis-à-vis the previous one, I would like to ask Karel to add something on that.
These expert judgments partially reflect really the situation or our belief that the, let's say, normal or standard persistency in the inflation dynamic is not valid right now, reflecting mainly the current situation of relatively, let's say, jumpy increase in the especially energy prices, and believing that this pass-through from these high energy prices will impact the economy a bit quicker than in the usual situation, than the normal pattern, and then it means also the fading out of this effect might be a bit quicker. So we judgmentally reduce the persistency in the pass-through of the energy prices in the overall inflation, which finally has an impact on the overall inflation and the response of the interest rate. So indeed, part of these expert judgments, that's the reduction of the positive contribution of the energy prices, especially in the longer horizon that is plotted there. And indeed, the same assumption is also used for the scenario. As I said, we believe that it's something like a feature that will be experienced by the domestic economy. So there is no difference. The only difference in this scenario is really the monetary policy horizon to which the interest rates are reacting to.
Yeah, to the question of the assessment of the past monetary policy, you know, it's a difficult question, and I will definitely need more time distance to be able to assess, let's say, respectively and properly. Okay, I am, of course, I respect that the main resume, which is saying that we should be a bit more tighten in the past. That's something which is difficult to get doubt. Nevertheless, it seems to me still that the size or magnitude of the mistakes from monetary policy point of view was really relatively very small, if happened, and I wouldn't, and so I do not feel a kind of big, let's say, fault that monetary policy was the important factor of the current inflationary wave. It seems to me that it was really much more the mix of the other politics, including certain, of course, part of ours. And the next lesson, maybe, I wouldn't, we definitely a bit underestimated it. My perception, my feeling is that I a bit underestimate how the Czech economy is ready to get on the path of the higher inflation for a longer time. That's something which I wouldn't expect before. Yeah? It was a long tradition of low inflation standards, comparing with this, let's say, comparable countries, and that's something which certainly changed in some respect. In the attitude of, I would say, in the attitude of many economic players or agents, it somehow changed in previous time. It seems to me maybe the last decade is a significant change in this respect. But we will see that only later on. It is necessary to be proven somehow by some research or more analysis. It seems to me it's still very acute.
Thank you. Would there be another question, please? Jan Vejmělek.
Hello to everybody. Jan Vejmělek, Komerční banka. I have a question regarding the alternative scenario. I guess it was prepared because it was requested by board members. So my first question is, what was the reason behind such a request to prepare such an alternative scenario? The second question, now you have, let's say, two scenarios, the base one and the alternative scenario. And what will be the next decision-making process, the next meeting? Which indicators will you follow? And then to more inclined towards base or alternative scenario. So these two questions for Mr. Governor. Thank you. And the third question, rather a technical one. The alternative scenario is based on the fact that in the Taylor rule it is shifted up by 2 quarters. Why 2? That was an arbitrary decision or assumption, or it is based on some research analysis? Thank you.
Yeah, I must say I'm not now able to remember in detail who was the, let's say, inspirator of that scenario. If somebody from the board, I'm not sure, even somehow inspired by colleagues from the monetary department, that we are in such an uncertain environment that would be proper to look at more potential scenarios, simulations, to get a bit broader context of the potential future. So there was not a specific request from the board to this scenario. We've been discussing with them the idea of which and how many different scenarios to the basic line we should see, we should have had prepared. And as regards the next meeting, my perception is that this extreme uncertainty will stay with us, more or less similar. So we will definitely once again have to opt for different potential scenarios and to choose what is the probably more or the most probably future and act according that. Yeah. So of course the basic scenario is there. This is baseline, and this is something which we will definitely use as kind of base mirror in which we will try to see what else could happen and how it should be combined with new data which will come in meantime, and we will of course wait what our colleagues will get to kind of update till this time. Thank you.
Within this scenario, the monetary policy horizon is more distant by 2 quarters, as you correctly mentioned, and our considerations have been such that under specific current circumstances, in the baseline, the central bank is assumed to be fully fledged, relatively strict inflation targeter, bringing inflation back to the target in standard monetary policy horizon, which is 12 to 18 months, which could be, in these current circumstances, relatively could imply relatively steep decline in inflation and steep rise in interest rates at the very beginning of monetary horizon. And if we take into account the uncertainty regarding the overall impacts of the war on both the domestic and foreign economies, including potential higher negative demand side effects via sentiment and via deep decline in real disposable income and decreased profitability of the domestic entrepreneur sector, the policymakers could ask what would be the result of stabilizing monetary policy if this monetary policy horizon is shifted somewhat more to the future. But simultaneously, we need to take into account very seriously that the stabilizing role of monetary policy cannot be fully put away. That's why we shifted the horizon by only 2 quarters, taking into account the results of our economic research on the topic of the optimal forward-lookingness within the forward-looking Taylor rule, which is a standard part of our core model. So in the past, we conducted so-called Battini-Haldane type of simulations, looking at the smoothing in the Taylor rule, looking at the optimal or looking at the various modifications of the monetary policy horizon, looking at the aggressiveness of the rule in the form of the weight which is put to the future inflation deviation from the target. And from that, we concluded that the current rule is close to optimal, and under normal situation, it would be a very good guide for actual monetary policy decision making. That's why we didn't want to divert very dramatically from the current setting, and that's why the shift is by 2 quarters, which should simultaneously enable the second round or the distributed effects of the world commodity price increases including those regulate price distribution over time, this setting should allow these effects to fade away kind of automatically or naturally, and only second round effects being present after that are tackled by the implied monetary policy reaction.
Who is next, please? Mr. Minčić.
Yeah, thank you. The Czech Chamber of Commerce. I have only one remark, not a question, but remark. It seems to me it would be very useful to prepare an alternative scenario based on a substantial escalation of the war, maybe for in-house purposes as minimum. That's my recommendation. You have to be ready to disaster. Thank you.
Yes, I will agree with you. Definitely, it's, I think, the part of what we are thinking and preparing in some respect. So, yes.
Luboš Komárek, would you like to comment?
Just a small note, we already prepared, let's say, one part which is, let's say, evaluating the foreign development for internal use, and this will be published in our Global Economic Outlook in May. But this is only, the evaluation, because the uncertainty is really huge, and I don't have words for this, but you can understand to me. On the other hand, the situation can change very quickly to both sides, positive and negative. Thank you.
Would there be another question, comment? Jaromír Šindel?
Thank you. I have one additional question to this alternative scenario. I don't know, but I got something like a feeling that from yesterday's presentation, maybe it's my misunderstanding, that Bank Board a little bit preferred this alternative scenario regarding the decision. So I would like to check what was the perception of the Bank Board, what is the preference, is the baseline or the alternative scenario? What would be the choice of the Bank Board to follow now?
The Bank Board decided what was decided, so it means, of course, it's closer to the alternative scenario in result. Nevertheless, there was some additional, let's say, points of discussion which are not the part of the alternative scenario. So the decision was based on much broader considerations, another risks and coincidences of what could happen and what we should somehow avoid or address. So it was more complex discussion on which was the background for the decision. But this is everything linked with already repeatedly mentioned uncertainty and risks which are extreme.
Okay, anyone else? Helena Horská, one more question.
Yeah, one more, so second round, thank you, because I was ready to leave some room also for other colleagues. Back to the FX as a not, would say, potential instrument for the monetary policy, but as you mentioned, the last resort instrument or some items. Did you discussed, or you are starting thinking about the revision of the contract between the government and you as a central bank on EU fund transition through your balance and start to transfer the EU funds at least partially and would say smoothly through the market to increase the liquidity of the market, because if you look on the market, you can see that the liquidity is still stretched after the intervention regime. So my question is if it's on the agenda or even if it's already in the phase of discussion or it's not yet on the agenda, even it's not discussed yet. And the second question, I'm coming back to the alternative scenario, because I was thought that the primary motivation to do the alternative scenario was to show what will happen if you will exclude the external price or would say supply shock to the monetary policy. Because what I as an analyst would expect from your analyst side is to have the alternative scenario that will use your opportunity to exclude the external shock, price shock, from your policy, monetary policy decisions. And I firstly thought that this is kind of scenario, but now I'm not sure. So thank you for question or answering my question.
As regards the agreement with the government regarding the conversion of inflow of European funds, we include in framework of the discussions in the discussions regarding the FX and use of the FX in monetary policy, we have touched as well, of course, this part, but I would say that generally the size, it seems to be not so decisive in this respect. So I would say we are really on very preliminary stage of thinking what could be in the future with this. It looks like rather not kind of crucial thing in all this package of the issues. To the second question, as I said, of course we have discussed and we have considered as well this scenario or specific simulation with excluding more the external supply side shocks from our consideration in short run, but finally it was also only on the edge of our decision, I would say. Basically, it's very difficult to in our specific current situation to assess what is the only external supply side and how to measure all of these second rounds and other round effects of these inputs into the price setting. So finally it was also part of the discussion, but definitely not a, I would say, base for a decision.
As we are running out of time, I would like to ask whether there is anything else someone would like to say. Well, since there are no further points, let me thank to all of you for participating in today's discussion. And now I'm giving the floor to Mr. Governor.
Yes, it's easy, as it was said in the beginning of our meeting. It's a last opportunity for me to see you in this setting. So I would like to also express from my from my side, the thanks to all of you for great cooperation during the time of my term. I am looking forward to meet you in another opportunities, another challenges which will definitely come, I am sure, for both of us. And please, I would like to invite you for the small refreshing to our club downstairs. There we can continue our discussion informally. Thank you very much and good luck.